Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again on our Wednesdays. We have two wonderful speakers today. We're going to start off with Anaïs Muller. She completed her PhD in France at CS Saclay and Université Paris Diderot. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied with pronunciations today. And after that, she was the Castro Postdoctoral Fellow in Dark Energy at Mount Stromlo at the Australian National University. Currently, she is a researcher at CNRS at LPC Clermont-Ferrand. She's interested in a variety of research topics, but focuses, but a lot of her work is on studying dark energy through type 1a supernovae. And she's a PI of PHINC, which she's going to talk to us about today. She belongs to several surveys working on supernovae. There are two LSST collaborations. There's OSDES, Dark Energy Survey, SkyMapper Transient Survey, SNLS, long list of things, lots of stuff. So we have somebody who's worked on many different projects. And she also enjoys doing science communication. She was the Castro astronomer in residence at Uluru. And she also helped launch a citizen science project on Zooniverse about finding transients. So, Anaïs, take it away, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite. I'm going to try to share my screen now. You should be able to see it. If you don't, please let me know. All good? So I do a lot of things, but my main focus is usually type 1a supernova cosmology. And nowadays I'm moving a little bit towards time domain astronomy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Dark Energy Survey, what we're doing with supernova, and what types of classifications we're doing, especially with machine learning, and then move towards the future to DES, to LSST, sorry, which will be this huge 10-year survey. So I'm in the middle of France. If you don't know where Clermont-Ferrand is you take the map and you point it in the middle. That's where I am living. Very beautiful place. Highly recommend to visit it. So why am I studying supernova? And I'm going to start with that probably. Is for those that don't know what supernova are, it's very luminous stellar explosions. And I'm not going to enter into the taxonomy, how many types of supernova there is, because there is a lot, from thermonuclear to quark collapse to peculiars. But something that I'm going to talk recurrently today is about the light curves. So what is a light curve? Basically, if you have the stellar explosion that you're seeing here, you can trace the brightness of that explosion over time. It will rise and then fade away. And that's what we're going to call light curves, and we're going to use for cosmology and also for classification. So the interesting part of type 1As, and I'm not going to enter into all of the other types, is, and you probably have seen this plot 1,000 times because this is the plot that everybody uses. The interesting thing about type 1A supernova is that on the top you see light curves for different type 1As, but you can actually standardize them and put them like in the same frame, and you can see it below that they look the same. So why is this interesting? The interesting part is if we want to measure distances in the universe, we cannot take a ruler, basically. So what we can use is to know, if we know the intrinsic brightness of an object, we can actually compare the observed brightness to the objects that we're seeing and compute the distances. And that's exactly what we do with cosmology and type 1a supernova. It's the 101. Now, the equation I show you here is how we compute distances. We call it the distance modulus. It's basically a comparison between the observed brightness, the absolute brightness, and some corrections that are linked to the light curve. So what we call color and stretch, which are linked to the shape of the light curve. And then there is another terms that I haven't put here for simplicity, like the mass step, which is in which hosts the galaxy, in which galaxy the supernova lives, and some other corrections that we do that I'm not going to talk about right now. But the main idea is this: we want to find type 1a supernova to measure distances. And why do we want to measure distances? This is something that has been done since the 90s with type 1a supernova. It's basically if we live in this galaxy here, hopefully you're seeing the animation, And the universe is expanding. We want to measure, we cannot wait an infinite amount of time, well, not infinite, but a large enough amount of time to see the universe expanding. We want to measure it. We want to measure this effect because we don't know what dark energy is, and this is what dark energy produces. And to do so, we want to measure distances and velocities of galaxies around us, far away. But to measure distances, we use type 1a supernova. So that's what we do in high-redshift cosmology, basically, with supernova. So we measure distances and redshifts, and I'm going to tell you where do we get them both. So this is the motivation, and this started in the 1990s with the discovery of the accelerated expansion of the universe, which motivated the explanation of dark energy. And since then, we have had several generations of supernova experiments. And we're now in the 4th generation with the Dark Energy Survey. Rutu probably has told you a lot about it. But in case you haven't heard it, it's a survey that lasted officially 5 years, 6 years kind of, from 2013. And the idea is to do precision cosmology to figure out what dark energy is. And for this, we use 4 primary probes: galaxy clusters, weak lensing, large scale structure, and type 1a supernova. And that's where I work. I work in the supernova working group in the Dark Energy Survey. And during these 5 years, we should have obtained around 2,000 well-measured type 1a supernova. So 2,000 is a big number. When we talk about current constraints on cosmology analysis, we're talking about a couple hundred type 1a supernova. So we're talking an order of magnitude higher. Now, to give you an idea of the depth of the survey, so this will start rolling in a moment, but before I start rolling, you can see some surveys here in color. So WiggleSet is in blue, Gamma is in green, SDSS is in pink, 2DF in red, and Dark Energy Survey in yellow. And you can see that we have deep fields that are the very thin, further away fields, and then we have a wide field as well. So this is an idea of the spatial distribution of the images that we're taking. And if you can see little white points shining out in the yellow deep fields, those are type 1a supernova. And these are specifically the type 1a supernova that we use for the 3-year cosmology analysis. So I think this is a good idea to get how far away are we looking with the Dark Energy Survey. So basically, in astronomers' terms, instead of looking at this, I think this is NGC, I don't remember which one, what we're doing is we're searching for type 1a supernova that are not exploding in that very close by galaxy, but in this galaxy. And here you have a supernova exploding. So this is the type of images that we're analyzing all the time. So what we do is basically do aperture photometry, or difference imaging photometry first, to figure out if there's something changing in the sky. And we measure our light curve, so the flux against time. So for example, you can get a rising light curve. So you're seeing something that is rising in luminosity. And to figure out if you have type 1a supernova or not, because you still don't have that information, the traditional method, and the method that has been done since the 90s, is to do a spectroscopic follow-up, which is basically, you take the telescope, you point to this object, and you figure out if it's a type 1a supernova, because it's the only one that we can standardize. Well, you can standardize some subtypes of corona, but the most precise results is type 1a supernova. Then you take the light curve when it finishes exploding and fading away, well, rising the brightness and fading away, and you compute the distances, and then you get the redshift from the host galaxy spectra, because it's more precise than the supernova spectra, actually. And that's how we did for the 3-year supernova results. So we have a 5-year survey. We took 3 years. We analyzed them and produced this Hubble diagram. And you can see in this Hubble diagram that you have distance modulus in the y-axis, and in the x-axis is redshift. In yellow are low redshift supernova 1A. In red are the dark energy survey spectroscopically confirmed type 1A supernova for the first 3 years. And with this Hubble diagram, we have, this is not working, sorry. We have constrained, of course, W, the equation of state of dark energy that you can find in the left y-axis against omega matter, and we have a very vanilla result that doesn't change our current perspective. But what is interesting is that we're systematics dominated. And we all know this on precision cosmology. And one of the main systematics uncertainties that we have, and I put you in the right, our budget, is selection efficiency and the biases that we have due to that. So in order to tackle a little bit more on this, we can, instead of using spectroscopic follow-up to type the type 1A supernovas, we can use new techniques like photometric classification. And this is the topic of my talk today. And the good thing is that it can be done a posteriori. You don't need to have the supernova right now shining. You can have reproducible selection functions. You have a less biased sample because you can have a larger sample over a larger range and properties, because you don't depend on other telescopes, but you also don't humanly bias the sample. So this is what we're doing for the 5-year supernova analysis of the dark energy survey. Not only this, there's a lot of things that I listed some of them here. But I'm going to talk mostly right now photometric classification. So we have at least 3 photometric classification algorithms in the dark energy survey that we're testing. I'm going to mention one that is the one I work mostly on, that is called SuperNova. So the idea behind this algorithm is the following. You basically just use the Light curves, the flux against time, without any correction of distances or anything, and you can classify this supernova into type 1A or non-type 1A. And what you're seeing in the GIF is basically that you can get a prediction at any time step of this light curve. So for the dark energy survey, that is not that important because the survey has already finished taking data, but for future experiments at LSST, this is something interesting. So it actually has quite a good performance. We can get samples with purity equivalent to those of a spectroscopic classified samples, that is around 98%. And we have shown that it reduces population biases for type 1A supernova classification. So if you take a photometric classifier like this one, and you try to figure out what is the power of it, apart of what I'm telling you, I have this animation, I think this is really nice, because you can see the different fields of view, the different fields of the dark energy survey, the deep fields. In red is the 3-year sample, and in blue is the 5-year sample, okay? And this is year by year. And you can see how many more type 1A supernova we're actually selecting using photometric classification instead of spectroscopic classification. So this is quite fun. And we're working on this analysis, and I cannot show you the results because we're still working on this. But the idea is that the Hubble diagram will look like this with around 2,000 type 1A supernova, when before the one I showed you was only 300 type 1A supernova. And you can see some of the shapes of the contours that are completely blinded. So don't take it as we have found new physics, and just take it as an indication that we're working in our systematics and reducing them. So this is what I wanted to show you from a dark energy survey. I think photometric classification is really unveiling the power of these surveys, because we have so much data that we can only use if we have this classification of type 1A supernova. And it's pretty exciting to see actually the redshift range increases so much. So it's really interesting to see. Now I'm gonna stop with dark energy survey and go towards the next era, which is LSST. So the Roebling Observatory Legacy Survey of Space and Time, so I will call it LSST from now on because it's a very long name, will basically be the largest camera observing the sky over 10 years. So I don't know if you have seen the first picture the camera took is a broccoli. It's amazing. But the idea is LSST will be looking at the sky for 10 years, mapping the southern sky. And it will produce around 1,000 images per night, which is approximately 15 terabytes per night. But what's interesting for time domain astronomers is that it will have 10 million transient candidates per night. So we're talking a huge amount of data, and we're already constructing tools to actually deal with this large volume of data and figure out which are the interesting transients. Now, if you look at it from the Type 1a supernova cosmology, LSST will have 30,000 million transient candidates for the whole decade, which, depending on how you do the cadence and do the projection, this is a very approximately number, it could be up to 300,000 Type 1a supernova. Now, for cosmology or not, it depends also on the observing strategy. So this is just a ballpark. So you can do, of course, photometric classification to select this Type 1a supernova, or you can do a spectroscopic classification that this will take you 10% of the candidates that you have. Now you will tell me, well, already with 3,000 Type 1a supernova, why do you need to do photometric classification? Well, because of selection biases, which are a problem. But I'm going to talk now about how do we make the most of our limited spectroscopic resources. Is it worth it just pointing to Type 1a supernova? How do we know this is promising Type 1a supernova? Can we do something different? And to talk about this, I'm going to talk about LSST a little bit. So LSST will take an image of the sky and produce the raw data. And every 60 seconds, it will release what we call the alert stream, which is difference image. It basically will do a difference between a science image, let's say from tonight, against a template image, and you will get a difference image. And then you will have some measurement of the flux and have a light curve. So this light curve may not be complete, of course, because this is a live stream. But the whole point is it will be 10 million per night, which basically means, and this is my cartoon explaining it, it will have this huge tsunami of alerts, and you are trying to find the little fish. And to deal with this, there is a call for community brokers that will basically ingest the alerts, process them, add value, reduce the stream, because the 10 million is a lot every night, and redistribute it to teams, telescopes, so they can find the little fishes. So that's what a project that I'm PIing for is. It's called FINC. We actually put our first paper in the archive last week, so you can take a look on it. It's a new generation of broker for the LSST community. It has been created specifically for LSST, for the large data volumes that LSST will have. So it's based in this data stream. We are a collaboration that has over 20 different affiliations right now. We want more people, so if you're interested, we'll be more than happy to hear from you. And it's not only supernova. So the idea is to do different science cases. This is a little bit the architecture. I'm not going to enter into it, but the whole idea is that you will get the alert stream of all the things that are potential interesting transients. We will process them and then communicate it to science team, telescopes, the general public. I'm going to talk about the machine learning classification in FINC. So it's part both of the processing, because we process these alerts to actually figure out what are they, and it's also part of what the science collaborations, the teams want to hear. So I'm going to talk about supernova, but these can be applied to many different things, and we have applied it to different cases like microlensing, searching for GRB events in CTF data, because right now we don't have any data for LST, so we're testing it with CTF. So let's go back to supernova, and what can we do with FINC for supernova? But we can select those candidates that are interesting for a spectroscopic follow-up. So to do that, first you can to read off everything that is already known, all these variable stars, flaring stars, asteroids, known AGNs that are emitting a jet. So basically you want to do some cross-matching with catalogs, alert services to figure out what is not interesting. Then of course you want to do some early classification. And this time I don't have a GIF, but at every point of the light curve, which is in the top part of the plot, we can get a classification probability of this being a supernova or not. And this is what you see below in green and red triangles and I don't know, hexagon? No, it's not hexagons. I don't remember the name in English. But you can see that we can get a classification probability. So that way you can select things that are probable to be a supernova and target that supernova with a spectroscopic follow-up. So this is an example of a CTF supernova. And you can see that we classified it as a supernova very early on the light curve. We only require a couple of observing nights to actually classify it. So this is pretty exciting. And we want such an early classification that we tried it with the CTF alert stream in November, December last year, and we found that we can figure out if this is a promising supernova up to like just at the beginning of the light curve, like 10 photometric points, or even before maximum, which is the most important window to do spectroscopic follow-up. If you can get this is an interesting thing before it gets to peak peak brightness, then you can actually use your spectroscopic resources better. So this is important. It's also very important the number of layers we use. I just want to show you that we can reduce to 6% the stream, even more than 6% the stream that we get to find supernova. The numbers are huge, but this is a couple of months of data of CTF and orders higher. But we can do it pretty quickly. We can actually classify around 50 alerts every second with this algorithm, and we have other algorithms that are shown here also classify quite quickly the alerts. So this is all in preparation for LSST, but we're testing it with CTF data. So, of course, this can be further reduced. This is a very loose cut, let's put it that way, so people don't
I think we might.
Did we lose her?
I know she was having some internet issues. Hopefully,
Yes.
I'm right back in. Oh, she's back.
Sorry, my internet failed.
Okay. Are you close to wrapping up?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe I think if you continue without your video on, that might help a little bit.
Okay, yes. Let me do this. Up. I tried to disconnect everything that I didn't need it to use. No, it's not a good screen. I'm sorry. Are you seeing now the presentation again?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess my internet is going. I think, I don't know if I lost you here or here. Where did I lose you?
I think the slide with the very colorful plot, I would say.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so all this is in, just to refresh the mind. So this is Think applied to the CTF data stream for 2 months. So what you want to see here is how much can we reduce the data stream? So basically, if you have 2 million of events, can we figure out a way to select those that are actually the best supernova candidates? And here we did some loose cuts, and we can get that to a reduction of 6% of the stream. Of course, these are loose cuts. So things can be improved if you are actually trying to find a very pure sample or the top 10 promising events. But this is just an idea to see a completeness with a reduction. And one of the challenges that we tried to tackle was how fast can we do all this processing, all this classification, all this cross-matching. And you can see that we can get 50 alerts reduced per second. So basically, in 30 seconds between we get the first batch of data and we take it out, we basically can process everything without any problem, which is very important for LSST because you will have a backlog of many thousands of transients. And this is what I was telling you. You can improve on this reduction. This is a very loose cut. So the last thing I wanted to mention was, what else can we do apart from spectroscopic follow-up of things that we already know what we want? We can improve the training for photometric classifiers. And I think this is the most interesting thing for LSST. We know that for photometric classification, we need to understand what there is in the sky, and we don't understand it. So you can do different things. You can select a supernova or transients that you don't know very well and try to get follow-up, like a spectra or photometry to understand it and create templates, and you can train these photometric classifiers. And the only other thing that I want to mention is using active learning. So instead of using the machine learning model just to provide a classification, you actually put in the loop, and this is what you see here to the right, is that if you have a label pool, which is what you train your classifier with for the machine learning model, and then you apply that machine learning model to a non-label pool, then you can get a classification, but not of the best accurate classification that you can have, but which object will help you to classify better the supernova, for example. And this is what will happen. And this is something that we're working in Think. So does it work? It's a good question. Emily Shida and the group of collaborators have shown that the accuracy of photometric classifiers, if you actually basically use active learning, improves much faster if you do like a random selection of the events that you actually learned from. So that's what you see the blue in the blue curve is actually the active learning approach, while the yellow and red are two ways of actually doing randomly selecting things to learn. And this is something we're working with Think as well. And the idea is that we can exploit really LSST by using the photometric classifiers, but also improving the photometric classifiers. So that's my wrap up. I have told you a little bit what's the status of supernova classification for a current survey that is the dark energy survey and the power of photometric classification and samples. And I told you a little bit about Think, which is a project that we're building right now to actually have that power of supernova in the next decade. So if you have questions, there is a webpage and also our paper that it was just released. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Do we have any questions? We are running a little behind, so maybe we have time for one question or so. You can ask in the chat or raise your hand or ask in Slack, although nobody's been using that, I guess. Okay, I guess we don't have any questions. If you find later that you do, we still have several slots open on Anais's meeting schedule, so feel free. And I'll hand it over to Peter now.
Thanks,
right.
and sorry for the internet, by the way.
It's fine. That's what we all deal with these days. It's fine.
It's just part of the territory. All right, our next speaker will be Dr. Razia Emami Maybadi. Do I have the pronunciation right?
Right, yeah.
Okay. And she is a theoretical astrophysicist. She has worked in cosmology and is also interested in gravitational waves. She studied in Iran at the Institute for Research and Fundamental Studies in Tehran and conducted postdoctoral research in the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, where she was affiliated with their Institute for Advanced Study. She is currently carrying out her research here at the CFA, where she is a fellow of the Institute for Theory and Computation. And today she will be speaking about the dark matter halo morphological types of Milky Way-like galaxies in the TNG 50 simulation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk. I hope that you're seeing my screen now. Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk about one of our most recent papers that was actually done very recently with my wonderful collaborator. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to the TNG collaboration for allowing me to use their private data. And I'm going to actually show you some of the interesting results that we got about the classification of the different morphological type of dark matter halo in the Milky Way galaxies in TNG simulation, and three categories of the halos that we hope to specify, either simple, twisted, or stretch halos. So my talk would be actually divided to two halves. One, in the first half, I would just like to actually motivate different galaxy types from the observations. And then in the second half, I try to use the simulation to give us actually some hints about the shape of the galaxy if you use dark matter as a tracer. So the first thing that I would actually like to consider is actually what we get from the observation. Of course, galaxies are very complicated, as you could imagine, but there are different classifications that one could imagine for the galaxies. Either they are early type galaxies or late type galaxies. And they, in some sense, they have a good, actually, just like distinguishing features that would be very helpful for us. For example, one such is that early type galaxies are most like actually randomly dominated stars around them. So they are more bulge dominated. But on the other hand, late type galaxies, they are more actually rotationally dominated. And they have just, they have a very clean disk around them. So around the center. So again, I should just alarm us that galaxies are much more complicated about whether they are quench or star forming and so on and so forth. And there could be some conversions, between this galaxy type and so on and so forth. But something that is actually good enough really for my consideration today is that I want to take this kind of like discrimination between different galaxy type, that if you have a bulge-shaped type galaxy, your stars are mostly like on random orbit, but if you actually have some kind of like a disky galaxy, they would basically be mostly like, on some actually given orbits. So if you want, that's actually the type of the basically classification or like actually criteria for my selections of the Milky Way galaxy in the TNG simulation. So in more words, here you actually see the bulge-shaped actually stars that are around the center. They have very randomly oriented orbits. On the other hand, these killer galaxies are really actually rotationally dominated. So again, I'm going to use this kind of understanding from the observation when I do actually this classification of the basically theoretically, selection of the TNG, actually of the Milky Way galaxy in the TNG 50. So in more words, there were some selection criteria for our Milky Way galaxy in the TNG. One was entirely most actually based on the dark matter halo mass that we just chosen to be actually around the Milky Way mass that actually has a dark matter halo mass of order 10 to 12 if you want. And then another thing that is even more important for us was actually having that disky-like galaxy. So we want to have good fraction of stars living in the disk. And by that, I mean the following. So I'm going to give you one slide of mathematics that are important. So I told you that stars that are part of the disk, they are rotationally dominated. What that it means is that if you have a disk, it does have an angular momentum. So the first thing that we computed was basically the specific angular momentum actually of the galaxy based on the stars. And then we aligned all the stars around that angular momentum. And we asked ourselves whether they are rotationally dominated or not. And by that, we computed epsilon, which is orbital circularity parameter. And we put the criteria that if this is above something, it just means that your star has a very actually good basically rotation actually around the center. So by that, I meant to say that these are disky stars. And not only that, we want to have a bunch of stars that satisfy this criteria. So because of that, we actually propose that our galaxies, no matter how do they look like when you actually do this dust attenuation in the imaging of the galaxy using a scale code, they should have a very killing behavior in the orbital circularity parameter, and if you want, in the distribution of the orbital circularity parameter. So something which is very interesting is that although these actually galaxies that you see here, they seem slightly different, whether they are face on or edge on, or like, you know, how much actually they do look like when you do this kind of like a dust attenuation. They have a very actually similar behavior on the distribution of orbital circularity parameter. And that's really enough that if you have more than 40% of the stars that are actually in these rotationally dominated orbits, we call them disky stars. And if you want to have a good actually comparison with those that they don't have such criteria, let's just consider like a bunch like galaxies. So you see that the distribution of the orbital circularity parameter is just very different, and actually consequently also that actually the image of the galaxy that you could get out of the dust attenuation are most like spherical than disky galaxy. So again, our selection of the galaxies was actually based on having a very, very defined disk in our galaxy. So next, after the selection that was done in the TNG simulation, we got a sample of 25 galaxies. That was a good sample. These are very high resolution, so you could treat them as a zoom-in simulation, and you could really actually have a fair study of their actually behavior. So that was what we did, and we tried to actually see what we get from the from this simulation for the morphology of the dark matter halo in, you know, in this simulation. Hopefully that can be applied later in the observation. So here is actually, let me just be very simple. Here is just basically projected density profile, 2D projected density profile of this disky Milky Way galaxy in the TNG simulation. And what you can actually easily see that there are some orbits actually, of course, this is going to be in the density of dark matter. I haven't yet show you actually the stars profile, nor I will show today. But what we can get is that according to, you know, something that people actually done from the observation basically is that you can classify based on your projected density profile your stars to 3 different actually type. Either you have oblate that are actually ellipsoid, or you have prolate, or you have triaxial. And there are actually in each of them, you can actually try to imagine to have some kind of ellipsoid that has A, B, and C, that in generally speaking, they can be different. So something that people have done, and it's just very standard in the literature, thanks to all of their efforts, is that people normally consider A, B, and C, and they just try to compute the access ratio. What is the AB over B or A over C? What is the minor to semi-major axis, or actually intermediate to semi-major axis? So this is very standard, and there are many actually studies. However, what we want to actually mention in this work, and as hopefully as the initiative to really think this way, is that there are much more information that you could possibly get from that kind of analysis. And the way to do that is that as soon as you actually talk about this inertial tensor, that again, I should just show you a little bit of math, is that according to any shapefinder algorithm, you're actually about to compute the inertial tensor, either reduced or full inertial tensor using different methods, either enclosed varium or local shape actually finder. I'm not going to go through these actually details, they are well studied. But in all cases, what you can get is that there are 2 different sets of information. One is the access ratio, A, B, and C, and the other, which is even more important, is basically the eigenvectors that you could imagine. And the way to imagine is that as soon as you have a matrix, which in this case is like 3 by 3 matrix, after you add up all of the contribution from all of your dark matter particles, you can also get 3 vectors. And that 3 vectors are full of information about a specific type of the morphology of dark matter. So in the next few slides, I'm going to tell you what people have got before us that we also try to actually follow them up using our own algorithms that actually I show you 2 of them. And what you can even get more than that, that are actually interesting, hopefully in a connection to observation that we would actually do, we would love to do along the way. So let me start with some statistical approach. Again, that's very standard. You can imagine to compute inertial tensor, you can compute actually its basically access ratios, and you can really see literally how do they look like if you consider hydro stimulation, dark matter stimulation, if you consider enclosed volume in which you consider all the dark matter particles within some actually volume and you just extend it, you know, to the outer layers of the basically actually galaxy, or if you just consider some local actually approach. There are some similarities, there are some differences, but that's not actually something that I'm going to focus today. And of course, at the end of the day, you can actually see whether you have oblate, means that your triaxiality parameter is less than 0.3, or you have triaxial, which is between 0.3 to 0.6, or you have prolate. So something for sure is that we don't have any prolate actually halos in our sample statistically nor individually. But what I want to focus on the rest of my talk is that, like what I told you, there are more information that I would like to actually draw your attention to it. So in this first actually a study that we are doing, it's like actually halo classification could be actually very intuitive. We are actually going to consider mostly on basically on the orientation of the basically eigenvectors along the radial orientation of different eigenvectors. So by simple halo, I mean just to say that they are very simple actually. But what do I mean by that? These are basically, so this is actually in this basically plots that I'm going to show you. These are different panels. One is the axis, which is basically A, B, and C to the radius that we consider. There are 3 actually panels here which are very important in our classification. And by that, I mean to say that imagine that you have actually 3 eigenvectors along the way, along different radius, and you can compute what are actually the angles between these 3 eigenvectors actually with different basically, you know, vectors, either like ijk of the Cartesian coordinate or the total angular momentum. And what you see here is that in this case, again, since we are better, we don't really know how the basically ellipsoid is oriented in the space, but what we can do is that we can classify what is the minimum, intermediate, and maximum eigenvalue, and then compute the actually eigenvector associated with that. So here, mean, intermediate, and maximum means eigenvector associated with the minimum eigenvalue, intermediate, and maximum. That's very well defined because you can sort them out and you see what is the minimum, intermediate, and maximum. So something that I want to really actually focus on that is that in the so-called simple halos in our classification, they are very simple. You rarely see any change in the angle of either minimum, intermediate, or maximum of basically eigenvectors with any actually vectors in the space, either ijk of the Cartesian or the total angular momentum. So interestingly, we actually could clarify that 36% of the halos in our sample are like that. I'm going to hopefully show you a movie afterward if I'm actually quick enough to also introduce the rest of the halos. And the other halos that we actually identified in our sample is twisted halo that again are about 36% of the halo. So you see that in this case, there is some gradual rotation of the eigenvectors. So imagine that again, I order them minimum, intermediate, and maximum eigenvectors. And what I see is that along the way, they are actually rotating. No matter what actually angle you consider, either in terms of ijk or the total angular momentum. So something which was very interesting to us is that sometimes when you go from the inner part of the halo to the outer part, which is about a video radius of 200 kiloparsec, you actually see that the rotation can even go about 90 degrees, which was very interesting. So that's actually consequently, you can also see that access ratios that are A, B, and C here, they get close to each other, not really close, but they get actually close to each other. So that's actually about 36% of the other halos. And then the last actually category, which is 28%, are a stretch halo. So the way to imagine that is also very simple. Imagine that when you consider inertial tensor, you have 3 eigenvectors, and these 3 eigenvectors, by definition, they are orthogonal to each other. So one could ask what would happen if you actually consider, according to our classification that is based on the minimum, intermediate, and maximum that are associated with basically ordering of the eigenvalues. You can imagine if you have a galaxy in which the ordering between them would actually change radially, in which it just means that the one that was actually up to, for example, this distance that was maximum now becomes intermediate, and the one that was intermediate now becomes maximum. So something that we could actually literally imagine is that, of course, since these are going to be orthogonal to each other, I should see an abrupt 90-degree actually change in the angle, because the eigenvector that was intermediate now becomes maximum that is orthogonal to that. So that was very interesting, and we could actually see that there is an abrupt change of the angle of the 90-degree because of the stretching of the halo. Sometimes it can even go actually several times, and you see that actually this is just like much more complicated. I should tell you that we cannot really limit ourselves to this actually to the classification. We can also imagine that in some cases you can have a combination of the twist that is basically gradual change of the angle and also a stretching of the halo. So these are very interesting. Let me, before actually going further, let me show you some very quick movies that are actually telling us, you know, how do they look like. So that's actually the first movie is going to be simple. Before I show it to you, actually, as you could see, these are basically 3D ellipses that I show you. So, and these are actually made of the eigenvalues and eigenvectors that we put them on a space. There are 3 different projections that you could imagine, and this is the radius of the halo that you could actually imagine. So before I show you, let me actually guide us that in this simple halo, we don't really expect to see, according to actually the plots that I showed you earlier, we don't really expect to see any change in the angle. Let's see whether this is actually, so this is the stretch halo. So according to the simple halo, we rarely see any linear change. And that's exactly what's going on here. So you see that the orientation of this ellipsoid is almost constant in this direction. Of course, when you go further and further out from the center, you are actually going to basically extend your basically, you know, ellipsoid actually. And this is using the Ewing, which was enclosed volume iterative method. On the other hand, if I consider the twisted halos that actually experience some kind of gradual rotation of even 90 degrees, you could actually see that the halo is just like rotating. So let's see what will happen. So here is actually the rotation. At first it was here, and now the halo is just like rotating very, very gradually toward the outer skirt of the halo. So that's very interesting. Again, sometimes you can actually even see something of order of 90 degrees that actually goes from the here to upward and then goes just twisted away. So that was actually something that we call them twisted halos. And lastly, something that I can actually call them stretch halos. So that's actually those that they should really literally show some kind of abrupt change. So if I just show it to you and actually beforehand tell you, we would imagine that in this case, the rotation should be more abrupt or more quick, because like what I told you, as soon as the intermediate or minimum or actually maximum just change their order, you should really literally see the abrupt change in the orientation of the ellipsoid. And this is what we see. So you see that at first it was on that halo, on that direction, now it's in this direction, now it's suddenly going the other direction. And that's like, you know, that's just like a huge change in the radial profile of the orientation of the actually halo. And by the way, that was basically the most crazy case. That's actually halo number, you know, halo number 10. I mean, in our case, this halo with this long number of the halo ID that has twisted, actually that has stretched several times. And we saw that at first we were in the other in this direction, then we abruptly changed our direction, and then afterward again. So that was 3 to 4 times of the stretching of the halo. So again, that's actually something that it's fair to say that before us, people didn't notice on that actually in this detail, but it's very interesting because again, thanks to a very high resolution of the TNG, we are able to see more actually features in the halos that are not definitely are going to be shown in the statistical manner. So what we can do, that's actually some kind of, you know, classification that I show you about the simple, they don't change the orientation. Twisted halos, they really literally change their angles, and a stretch halo, they just, you know, they abruptly change it. But then we actually also try to combine this or like connect this to the satellites of these halos, because we know that according to the simulation, to this hydro simulation, you can imagine to have like the subhalo, which is the central halo, and you can imagine to also have a lot of substructures that are part of the actually the friend-of-friend halo, but they are not part of the central halo. So something that we wanted to see was that, is this any actually possible link between the properties of the satellites and also the type of the galaxy? So here is actually, again, I'm actually having the classification of the minimum, intermediate, and maximum, meaning that eigenvectors associated with minimum, intermediate, and maximum eigenvalues. And something that I see is that for the simple halo, actually, when you consider the minimum eigenvectors, you actually see that they are very, very, very close to the center. And then they are mostly aligned. And we could imagine, because you could imagine that if you have a simple halo, most of the time, the total angular momentum is just aligned actually with the minimum eigenvectors, and there is not too much of the change. So it's just kind of understandable. On the other hand, twisted halo should actually show some bimodality, because although at first they are very much close to the minimum eigenvectors, the total angular momentum, at some point it actually rotates away. So that bimodality is actually seen in a wider range of the angles. And by the way, they are also a little bit further out. Of course, some of them, they could be closer, but some of them, they are out, but there are literally some bimodality in their behavior. On the other hand, stretch halos show some kind of actual population that are further out from the center. So this is basically the minimum. Intermediate one, it's just very simple because intermediate is actually perpendicular to the minimum. So when the minimum is along the actually angle between the minimum and the total angular momentum, it's just about 0. Intermediate one is going to be actually 90 degrees because of the orthogonality, and the same for actually applies for the twisted and stretch halos. We can also consider the maximum eigenvectors. Again, this one, since this is going to be orthogonal to the others, they actually show orthogonality, in the simple halos, bimodality a little bit in the twisted halo, and further out for the stretch halo. You can also imagine to actually consider the satellites' angular momentum themselves with the total angular momentum. Again, we see very clean and very interesting behaviors that they are very simple, they are completely aligned. The satellite total angular momentum, if you actually consider the median of that, with the total angular momentum of the halo, actually, of the central halo, they are a little bit basically bimodal in the twisted halo. And of course, for the stretch halo, they are more misaligned and also further out. So that was very interesting. Again, we tried to do this, in terms of our own kind of classification of the halos, and we see very interesting behavior. So now let's move in the last few minutes, let's move to the observation. So unfortunately from the observation, we lack of having such a behavior. Hopefully we are going to actually do a good job afterward according to the observations, especially for the stellar halo that are visible. But unfortunately, most of the time, when people talk about actually the shape of the dark matter halo, of course, this is going to be tough because dark matter halo is not going to be observed directly. But most of the time, people not even actually talk about the triaxial halo in which you have A, B, and C, but they'll just limit themselves to axial actually or axisymmetric halos in which you just actually break the rotational symmetry along the z-axis. So you could imagine that you have a disk, and then the three-dimensional spheroidal basically symmetry is just basically broken to having a disk which is symmetric any orbits that you could imagine, and then perpendicular to that. So it just means that the Q, which is the intermediate to the maximum eigenvalue, is just gonna to be 1. However, in our case, we actually, the first thing that we did, and also from the simulation point of view, people normally do, is that we break that out to basically breaking all the symmetry of the halos to have A, B, and C. So you don't have any spheroidal actually galaxy anymore, and you actually see that we don't really have them. So these are basically the predictions that we have according to red-ish. And also, so red is actually the hydrodynamic simulation that we consider. The purple line is actually the dark matter only. So you see that the effects of the baryons are huge and they are very distinguishable. And then you can also consider some kind of local shell non-iterative methods that are very close to what we get in both cases of dark matter only and also the hydro simulation. On the top of that, I also actually pointed out what people got from the illustrious simulation that are a little bit lower resolution before us. And we are seeing that we actually have within their actually larger error bars, we are in a good agreement. So that's actually bringing me to the future direction. Of course, this is kind of like the new actually way of thinking of the shape analysis in dark matter only, in dark matter simulation, both from dark matter only and hydro simulation. So we would really like to actually consider a better match to observation. And also we are going to consider, we are actually about to finish some papers that are also considering the shape of the stellar halo. For that, we also have to develop our own algorithms to also consider some local shell algorithms because the stars are much fewer and a lot of other details. We're going to hopefully consider shape in the velocity space to see whether there are some kind of, regular or irregularities. Again, this kind of actual angles that is not well studied before. And we are also consider to have a very good study of the redshift evolution of these galaxies, because we don't really know what actually caused this twist or stretching of the halo, which physical process, are they coming from the basically halo mergers, or coming from the assembly of different halos that you could imagine, or they're coming from basically accretion of the gas, like you can imagine to have like a minor or major mergers of the galaxies within their lifetime, whether they are gas poor or gas rich, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot to be done, and also to the connection to the observation. So if you might be interested on that actually directions, please come talk to me, especially if you are encouraging to have very excellent observers in our team that are mostly right now theoretical, actually, dominated people. So that's bringing me to the end of my talk. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions if any.
All right, thank you, Razi. If anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand in the participants window, or submit them via the chat. Any questions? Okay. Well, if not, thank you very much for a great talk, and thank you all for attending. And that calls to conclusion this week's episode of High Energy Pizza Talks in the Era of Coronavirus.